So Geoff, did you want to start us off?
Okay, well, the first thing to say is it's a typical Liberal budget, probably not as austere as some of us were led to believe by the Commission of Audit that came out fairly recently as well, which had the function of softening up the population and I suppose the commentators and other politicians for something much harsher. But having said that, there are some things that the budget is absolutely 100% wrong about, and the most important of those is that there's a crisis somewhere, or that there's something that needs to be repaired, or that we're facing an emergency situation. We are not. Australia, in terms of public debt, has one of the lowest in the world at 36% of GDP. By the way, parenthetically, I must say that the Queensland public debt is 26%, even lower than the Australian one, and the Australian one's almost at the bottom of the OECD league. So there is no problem of debt at the state or the federal level in Australia. And even if there were, even if we were somewhere like the OECD average, which is around about 100%, about the same as the United States and the United Kingdom, there's no logical, rational reason to think that that constitutes a problem either. But anyway, we're far from that. And public debt actually never needs to be paid off. It can just be rolled over and rolled over and rolled over. It depends on what the maturity term of Treasury bonds is. And some of theirs go out for 30 years, most of them around about 20 years, so there's a long time for cycles to play themselves out before there was any sort of even a technical problem. But there's no need for the hysteria about the need to cut back at all in Australia. Secondly, you've got to say that Australia has very low levels of public spending anyway. I think total level in Australia is about, I've just lost the figures now, about, but very close to the bottom, about 33 or 36% of GDP, whereas the OECD average is up around 41, 42%, like that. So we don't have to worry about excessive spending or an overwhelming tax burden in Australia. So it's a liberal paranoia that always wants to make an issue out of something which is not a technical problem and not even a political problem. Even if you look at some of the things that are uppermost in Joe Hockey's mind, and presumably the government as a whole, that is the so-called age of entitlement. Yes, we are living through an age of entitlement, if you define entitlement as something Social Democrats and Labour movements have always wanted, that is, to provide more and more, not only income compensation for unemployed and pensioners and sick people and so forth, but also more and more socially provided services outside the market. Then all OECD countries, all rich, mature capitalist countries are having an age of entitlement. They long, 40 years ago, decided they could afford to pay their citizens more and provide them with more, and they're doing it. We are doing it at a much more miserly level than most other countries, but it has become an age of entitlement, if you want to call it that. I would prefer to call it an expansion of citizenship entitlements, which is what it's properly called. But it's not illegitimate, it's not a problem, it's not gone through the roof. So you wonder why the government has softened us up so much for a cutback of these entitlements or social spending programs. Maybe that's all I'll say for the moment.
Sure. Kath.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the more specific initiatives in the budget, and it actually relates to what Geoff said, in the sense that some of these decisions don't really appear to be monetarily driven, they appear to be ideologically driven. So, for example, in the area of human rights, the current federal government last year created a new position in the Australian Human Rights Commission of a Human Rights Commissioner who didn't have a portfolio. Prior to that time, the Australian Human Rights Commissioners, or commissioners who worked in that organisation, had designated portfolios. So there's a disability commissioner, and there's an age commissioner, age discrimination commissioner, and a sex discrimination commissioner, and a race discrimination commissioner. Last year, George Brandis appointed Tim Wilson to the Australian Human Rights Commissioner as a generalist human rights, to the Commission as a generalist human rights commissioner. Interestingly, in yesterday's budget, he announced that the Commission's staff of commissioners would be reduced by one as of the 1st of July this year, when one of the existing commissioners' contracts expires, and that budget saving would be enacted by requiring one of the remaining commissioners to adopt a dual portfolio. So their current portfolio plus the portfolio of the person who had left. This is a strange development, because it was only last year that the government created, the very same government created the new Human Rights Commissioner, who is portfolio-less, but who has been engaged very heavily in public debate around some of the key human rights issues that the coalition government has chosen to champion. And one of those in particular is freedom of speech, understood in the more liberal tradition, so understood in the sense of freedom from government interference. And the current Attorney-General has launched a discussion around a draft bill that seeks to repeal the current racial vilification provisions in federal law, and Tim Wilson, the new Human Rights Commissioner, has intervened very heavily in that debate, including a speech he gave yesterday evening on Budget Evening to the Sydney Institute, in which he said, amongst other things, that he wants to institute a national consultation on human rights around what he calls the 4 forgotten freedoms, one of which is freedom of speech, another one is freedom of association. And this is really, again, interesting, because under the previous federal government, Australia was engaged in the largest ever human rights national consultation in Australian history. The Australian National Human Rights Consultation was independently chaired, and it engaged in discussion all around the country, well outside the capital cities, which is another thing that last night Tim Wilson stated was a desire of his, to go beyond the Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra triangle and reach out to rural communities in particular. This was done in the most expensive, wide-ranging and widely consulting human rights consultation that's ever happened in Australian history, that happened under the previous government. So I don't understand the push for this national consultation, except to the extent that it seeks to promote a particular view of human rights, and as I said, that's a particular libertarian one. So other things that have happened on human rights were that in the budget, a Commonwealth human rights education program had its entire funding of $1.8 million cut, so that has been abolished. The Information Commissioner and the Privacy Commissioner henceforth going to be merged into the Australian Human Rights Commission. So there's definitely a belief there that merging entities, and that's happened in other areas of the federal bureaucracy, will produce efficiency gains. And again, this is contrary to the evidence which shows that that restructures of this nature and merging of institutions in bureaucracies do not necessarily, they can, but they do not necessarily always save money and produce efficiencies. It depends entirely on how the mergers are done and how the institution in the post-merger state, how it conducts itself. In higher education, we've got a little bit of give and an awful lot of take. So the give is $140 million to renew the Future Fellowships program for one more year. That's a program for mid-career researchers to receive 4-year fellowships to conduct research, which means they're relieved from teaching and administrative duties for that time. Interestingly, for some reason that hasn't been entirely explained, the Future Fellowships in the next round will be restricted to Australian researchers only, which has not been the case in the previous rounds of Future Fellowships. The Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency has had its funding reduced by $31 million over the next 4 years. That possibly fulfils an election promise to reduce red tape and bureaucracy in the higher education sector, but that at this stage is a little bit unclear. The Australian Research Council has had the funding that it receives directly in order to oversee the most important grants programs in Australia reduced by 75 million over 3 years as an efficiency dividend, and the indexation on grants that universities and individual researchers receive from the Australian Research Council has been removed from a statutory indexation model to CPI, which actually reduces the indexation available, which means that universities will have to pay more of the infrastructure costs when their staff members engage in research than used to be the case. And as we know, students are going to be asked to make a greater contribution towards the cost of getting their degrees. And interestingly, that also includes PhD students who up until this time have been regarded as contributing to the generation of knowledge and have not had to pay fees as long as they were accepted and enrolled. They usually got a fee waiver. There have been some exceptions to that for international students, but domestic PhD students until now haven't been asked to pay their own fees, and that is changing as of last night's budget.
Thanks very much, Kath. Liz?
Okay, well, Indigenous people were not a big focus in the budget politically, so they weren't actually mentioned in the budget speech, and in some ways that can be kind of a relief in Indigenous affairs, because when you come to issues like the age of entitlement, welfare cuts, Aboriginal people often become the political football. So in a way they were left out of that politically, but when you look at the actual consequences of the budget, they are one of the big losers in the budget, if you like, in a couple of ways. The first way is in terms of direct cuts to Indigenous focused programs, and the second way is in terms of indirect impacts, because the thing that we need to remember about Indigenous affairs since the Howard era and the abolition of ATSIC is that most Indigenous services are not delivered through Indigenous specific programs, but they're actually delivered through mainstream health and education services. So the changes that are made there are going to have a disproportionate impact on Indigenous people because of their disadvantage. So firstly, in terms of direct cuts, they announced about $500 million worth of savings in Indigenous specific programs over the next 5 years. Considering that the Indigenous specific programs is quite a small pot and doesn't include basic services, that's a lot of money. And I mean, the implication of the way it was phrased was that this is going to be through mergers, as Kath said. It's not going to affect frontline services, so they've taken 150 programs and condensed them into 5 basic programs.